what I'm asking you to do is to keep curiosity, to have a mindset of being curious and perhaps surprised with some of the topics we're going to talk about tonight. And who knows, it could be useful for you in your personal life and also with your clients. So yes, so that's what I'd like to achieve tonight. So the reason why I'm passionate about relationships is from my own history to start with. So like most of us, I've had relationships, and I've always been intrigued on how it works. How come so many people struggle in communication? How come so many relationships fail? How come it's not that easy to be in a relationship? So that's been my starting point in exploring the topic, and also with my clients. Even though it's not something that I chose to go into, so I never decided to have a niche and specialize in relationships, what I've noticed is a lot of my clients came to see me and presented me with relationships issues, communication issues, and I started to explore with them what was going on there and exploring what I call codependency. So codependency is, in a nutshell, it's how the unhealthy ways people relate to each other. So I've discovered through working with my clients and my own research that actually a lot of people have some degree of codependency, and that's what got me started into that field. So one of the first questions I asked myself was, how come we're not taught relationship skills? So when you look at our educational system at school or our parents, we're taught everything we need to know about science, about history, geography, but there's not many, even though it's changing now, there's not many topics that are focusing on psychology, communication skills. And then here we go, we finish school, we go to college, we meet someone, and we expect to know it all. We expect to be experts in relationships, even though we've never been taught how to do this. And I find this quite intriguing on how, when you look at psychology, which is a very complex topic, I'm quite intrigued on how we're supposed to do this without being educated, without having any knowledge, any education on it at school, for example. So you may argue that we learn this at home. I don't know about you, but certainly I didn't get my relationship skills, or maybe I did, anyway, that's another story. But our parents would have taught us, supposedly, relationship skills. But where would they have got that? From their parents, from the previous generation. And if you think about it, psychology is being studied for only a bit more than a century. So where would our great-grandparents would have learned their relationship skills? And I think that explains a lot, actually, why so many relationships fail and why we struggle so much in relationships, because actually we haven't learned it from anywhere. Because our parents or our families, they're not experts in communication in relationships. And obviously we learn from them, and they learn from their parents, and so on. So I think it's time we start to look at how we can learn those skills and how we can actually consciously decide to explore how to work with relationships and how to communicate in the most effective ways. Here's a question. What do you think create issues in relationships, in most relationships? I'm going to talk mainly about romantic relationships tonight, but you could also apply this to work relationships or any type of relationship with your friends as well. But what do you think generally creates issues? Yes?
Expectations.
Expectations, very true. Communication issues. But what specifically in communications?
What not said.
Assumption, sorry?
What's not said.
Yes, what's not said. The lack of communication, perhaps. Anger.
Rejection.
Emotions, rejection. Misunderstandings as well. I think in my own experience, and probably in yours as well, I think a lot of tensions and a lot of issues in relationships come from misunderstandings. And in friendship as well, in the workplace as well, we don't really understand each other. And I think what's fascinating is, how come as human beings we're supposed to be a very evolved species, how come we struggle so much to understand each other and be understood? And that was my journey, and that's how I came to the project itself. What's going on there that we struggle so much in communicating and understanding and being understood? So that's what we're going to explore tonight. What I want to talk about is what I call the project itself. So it's basically our stuff that we bring into the relationship, how it works, how it feels when people bring their stuff, how we do this, so to put in the light actually the patterns that are at play. I'd like to explore the alternative. It's not all gloom and doom. There's possibility to actually get rid of those patterns and actually go into what I call the realized self. So we're going to look into the realized self, both on a personal level and within relationships. And then we're going to look at how to do this, because that's, as coaches, you know, that's a very important question, is how do we do this? Unfortunately, I only have an hour and a half to cover all this, so I'm going to just begin to talk to you about some of the tools that can help you or your clients to move from projective self to realized self. However, if you're interested more about knowing about those tools or knowing more about the patterns, the hidden patterns at play in relationships, codependency, I'm running a workshop on all this in February, and towards the end we'll tell you how you can sign up for this. So, having said all this, what's your understanding of projected self? So when I talk about this obscure term, projected self, what do you understand? What do you think I'm talking about? That's what I thought. So the starting point is there's something in psychology called projective hypothesis, which in NLP we call filtering. And it's basically the ability as human beings that we have to put a meaning in an ambiguous situation. So when we experience an ambiguous situation, what we tend to do is we tend to give it a meaning. That's a projection. That's a filter. Now, what's this projection? What's the projection? Where's the projection coming from? What determines the meaning we put onto situations? What do you think?
Our experience.
Our experience, absolutely. Lovely choir over there. What else? Our values, absolutely. Culture. Expectations, again.
Is it also like the parts of ourselves that we kind of disown and that we can't be with?
What do you mean by that?
So you might be might feel quite angry, but not quite be connected with that anger.
Okay.
And so you sort of project that out, and so your meaning becomes about anger in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So that what's in the unconscious mind that we're not necessarily aware of, that we're projecting. So all this, absolutely true. Our beliefs, our experience, our values, everything that makes us who we are. And we bring that with us into the world, into our communication with others. And that's what I call the projected self. It's all our stuff we bring, based on our experience mainly, and our values, our beliefs, that we bring into our communication with people. That's what I call the projected self. Does that make sense? Yeah? So it's important that we understand what I mean by that for the rest of the talk. So there are two situations where we tend to project ourselves. The first one is when we make a meaning out of a situation. So typically a typical situation is when, for example, you plan to spend the day with a friend and they told you, I'll call you on Saturday morning and then we'll take it from there, we'll decide what we do. And they don't call. And you spend the entire day sitting there feeling miserable, waiting for their call, if you're not a coach and if you haven't taken the phone and called them first. Now, what do we do with this? What do we tend to do when a situation like this happens?
Blame it on the other person.
Sorry?
Blame it on the other person.
we tend to blame it on the other person. But even before we do this, when we don't know what's going on, when there's an ambiguous situation at play, what do we do? We try to find meaning, we try to create a meaning. And some people will think it's because that friend forgot them, that's because that friend doesn't care about them. Some people will think it's because they had an accident, some people will create another kind of story. What's very interesting here is we all create different stories. And you won't have two people, well, maybe you will, but most of the time we will create a different story depending on our past experience, depending on our mood on that day, depending on our beliefs perhaps, or expectations again, but we create different stories. That's the beginning of us projecting who we are, when we try to make a meaning out of an ambiguous situation. Now, how often does that happen? How often are you facing a situation where you don't really know what's going on, there's an ambiguous meaning attached to it, and you start to try to understand what's going on, or create or make up a solution or an understanding of what's going on? How often does that happen? Quite often, isn't it? So that's the first place we project. And that one is the easy one. You can imagine what's coming. The second place we project, you can guess what it is when we interact with other people. So in that situation, you're alone at home, you're making up your little story, you make yourself miserable with your little story, but that's only affecting you so far. But then, when you take it and you start to communicate with other people and you start to interact with other people, which we tend to do quite a lot, and you start to project yourself, that's when trouble starts. So just imagine a typical situation, another one, where, for example, the wife comes home in the evening and she's agreed with her partner that he was going to cook dinner at night because she had a long day and she's tired. She arrives home and dinner is not ready. What tends to happen in the situation? Exactly. So she starts, typically, she starts to react, not necessarily in a nice way, so generally it goes a little bit downhill, and then what happens, she starts to create what we call in NLP complex equivalent. You didn't make dinner, therefore it means that you don't love me, for example. Now, if you look at this from an external perspective, is it true?
Yeah. No.
Exactly. It can be true or it cannot be true. It depends on the situation. Again, we're all going to create a different meaning depending on our experience and our values, what it means for us. What it would mean if we were that person. So if we are the one who doesn't cook dinner, what does that mean for us? And then we project this onto the other person. Now, what happens, obviously, if the wife starts to attack? What's likely to happen? How is the husband going to respond to this? Yeah, he's not going to be very happy and not going to make dinner, definitely. Now, what would happen? So the wife has created her own little story that the reason why dinner is not ready is because he doesn't love her. What happens if, as a reaction, the husband creates his own story on the wife's reaction? So, for example, she starts to nag him. What happens if the husband starts to make his own interpretation of the wife's reaction? So if he goes, she's saying that because she's trying to emotionally blackmail me. Exactly. What happens if the husband does that?
Just amplifies and then goes out of proportion.
Exactly. It goes out of proportions. Absolutely. And then what happens in the relationship? Yeah, there's an issue. How often do those kind of situations happen? How often have you experienced this? Or do you know people, let's pretend you haven't experienced this if you're How often have you met people or heard people or seen clients who experience this kind of situations? Yeah. So I think that's where I come from. I see that in my practice all the time. And my question is, what can we do to change this? And I'm sure for those of you who are coaches, I'm sure you've seen that as well. And I think it's time we start to look at what happens, the structure underneath that. What are the patterns at play? What's the structure, and what can we do to change all this? So that's what I want to look at tonight. So let's look at how we project ourselves. So what do we do when we project? The first thing is what I call our buttons. So a lot of the time, when we're upset, we're actually not upset because of the situation. Most of the time, sometimes we are, but most of the time, we're actually upset because of something else that's running in the background. Most of our issues, whether it's our fears, our insecurities, our pain, actually comes from our childhood. I'm sure you've heard about this. It's typical traditional psychology is everything comes from the childhood. Well, it's kind of true. A lot of issues we have actually come from our childhood. And what happens is, when we don't have a perfect childhood, which not many people do, we carry those wounds, we carry those unresolved issues with us into our present lives, especially in relationships. Why in relationships? Because when you're in a meaningful relationship, when you're very close to people, whether it's a partner or friends, what's actually happening is you get emotionally disclosed. So you become vulnerable because people start to see the real you. Now, not a lot of people feel very comfortable with being seen, the real them. A lot of people prefer to hide. But when you're in a meaningful relationship, whatever relationship that is, the real you starts to come out. And that brings fears, insecurities, that brings a lot of issues from the past that haven't been resolved. Now, I know it sounds a little bit negative, but that's also the place where you can experience a very deep emotional connection with someone. But the reality is, what comes with the connection, or before that deep, meaningful connection, is actually all your stuff that you've put on the side for many years, that you maybe avoided looking at, or you didn't know was there, starts to come up. And there's a theory in psychology that says that basically all our unresolved issues from our past with our parents, we carry them with us, and we try to look for people unconsciously. We don't do this consciously, of course. Well, some people do, but most of the time it's unconscious. We try to look for people that remind us of those parental figures from our past that we have issues with, that we haven't resolved, in an attempt to resolve those issues. So what it means is, for example, if you have issues with your mom from your childhood that you've never resolved, the theory says that you will spend your life looking for people that remind you of your mom at the unconscious level, so then you can start resolving those issues. So that's one theory. That would explain why we keep repeating patterns. Have you noticed how we tend to always look for the same type of people, whether it's partners or people at work or friends? We tend to attract a similar pattern in personalities. Have you noticed this? Or is it just me? Have you noticed this?
Yes.
That's one theory. I prefer to look at it from the perspective of the limbic brain. So the limbic brain is the part of our brain that processes emotions. So again, when you look at your childhood and unresolved stuff, it will leave some scars in your memory, some emotional scars. And basically when you're an adult and you meet people, if those people remotely remind you, or the situations remind you of those unresolved issues in your past, your limbic brain will fire and you will have emotional response to what you believe is the current situation, but it's actually what your limbic brain will have noticed that is similar to those issues in the past that you haven't resolved. That's what I call the buttons, in a nutshell. Okay, the buttons is all this unresolved stuff from our past that we still carry with us and we still respond to in the present, because as soon as your brain notices a trigger that's similar to that past situation, you will respond to it. Most of the time, you won't even know that you're responding to the past. Okay, so when you have a strong reaction, it's because one of the buttons has been pushed. So that's the first way we project ourselves in a relationship. The second way is what in psychology they call our shadows. So shadows is the part of ourselves that we don't really like. So you know how in self-development and in all those nice Facebook posts they tell you you need to love yourself and you need to accept yourself fully. Now how many of you in this room fully, unconditionally love and accept themselves? Okay, a few. Well done. That's very good. It's quite difficult, isn't it? It's quite difficult to look at our dark sides, to look at the part of us that we don't like, the part of us that we even may be ashamed of. Now, people who suffer from codependency, and actually the statistics say that between 96 to 98% of people suffer from codependency at some level. So codependency is how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to other people in an unhealthy way. One of the patterns of codependency is perfectionism. Is people who want to be perfect. They don't accept that they have flaws, they don't accept they have weaknesses. Now what happens to those people who reject part of themselves? They can't face their flaws, they can't face those dark sides. What happens to them when they meet someone who has that specific quality or that specific characteristic? Yes. They reject. Because it's a mirror. They see in that person a mirror of that characteristic, that trait that they hate about themselves. So how do they respond to that person? Most of the time they reject that person, they criticize that person. It's not about the person, it's about their own stuff. It's about their inner projection. It's about going, they show me what I really don't like about myself. And again, the limbic brain responds to this and we have an emotional reaction that most of the time has got nothing to do with the person that is in front of us. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Does that resonate so far? Yes. Okay. So there's another way, there's a lot of ways actually, unfortunately, that we project. And I just came up with a few tonight, but I'm always curious to discover more. It's when we take things personally. So, how many of you, I can see some nodding and some smiling already, how many of you experience this regularly, that a situation happens and you believe it's your fault? So, typical example is you're walking in the street, you see a friend, you wave at them saying hello and they look at you blankly. They might wave, they might not. They definitely don't look friendly and they don't look happy to see you. How many of you, experiencing a situation like this, will start to ask yourself, what did I do wrong? Yeah? Sounds familiar? Now, this is taking things personally, because what could be happening in that situation?
They could be upset for the business.
The friend can be upset. What else? Sorry? They didn't see you. Absolutely.
Their dog died a minute ago.
Specifically. They can be upset because their dog died, or a cat, or someone else. They could not have seen you. But what happens if you start to interpret their reaction and take it personally? How is that going to affect your relationship with that friend the next time you see them? Not very.
You'd be insecure.
Sorry?
You'd be insecure next time you meet that
You could
person.
be insecure, or how else could you respond?
Change how we behave.
Yeah, in a lot of different ways. You can be angry, you can be upset, confrontational. Now, I've got a funny story to tell you on this one. One of my friends, she's got a twin. Of course, they both live in the same city. And she told me one day that one of her best friends came up to her, yelling at her, going like, "What's wrong with you? I saw you in the street the other day. I was being nice, I was being friendly, and you literally told me to F off. What's wrong with you?" It was a twin. I was fed up to be mistaken for my friend. We all create stories. We all make up some explanation to a situation that a lot of the time don't have anything to do with that. Now, when we take things personally, that's another way we project. Again, that's the typical pattern of codependency, feeling guilty immediately for no reason, imagining that there's something wrong. You've done something wrong, something that is running for you that your friend found out about. You know, the typical being found out fear. Again, that's a pattern of codependency. So taking things personally is, again, a way we project ourselves into communication. Another one that I really like, that I'm really intrigued with, is a bit similar, is how we believe we're expert at mind reading. Have you noticed this? A lot of experts in this room, obviously. Now, again, coming back to those ambiguous situations, so the friend or the phone call or any kind of situation where you don't really know for sure what's going on in that situation. What do? We assume that we know what the other person is thinking. We know what's going on for the other person. We create our own story about what might be going on for that person. You've noticed that? Now, the question is, why do we create stories? Why do we do this? Why do we so often try to create a meaning out of ambiguous or unknown situations? What do you think that is?
Based on your insecurities.
Insecurities, that could be one. What did you say?
Makes us feel safe, same thing, insecure.
Insecurities.
Making sense of your world, and so it's like feeding your filter that if you make sense of it, then this is what's going on.
And what's at the root of why do we need to make sense of it? To control. And where does that come from? Insecurities is a big one. I think there's something that we call in NLP the communication model that most of you maybe are familiar with if you're coaches. The way our brain works, so it's not just our insecurities, but you can use that excuse next time. The way the brain works is you've got the world, which is what we call the external event. Now, every day, there are 2 billion bits of information coming into our brain through our senses. Our brain cannot process 2 billion bits of information. Otherwise, we go mental. So what the brain does is you've got the external world over there. It goes in through your senses, so the thing you see, the thing you hear, the sensation, the taste, the smells. And your brain has to go, okay, I'm going to overload if I take it all in, so I need to filter. I need to choose what's important, I need to ditch what's not important. Now those filters, they depend on our experience, they depend on our beliefs, our values, everything we talked about before. So according to those criteria, our brain will decide what to keep and what to ditch. And once your brain has done its filtering thing, then we get what we call an internal representation, our story. And a lot of the time, actually most of, now I can say, all the time, it's not accurate compared to the external event. It can't be, because we can't take 2 billion bits of information. The brain is actually able, have you heard about the magic number 7? The brain is actually able to process 7 bits of information at a time. 2 billion? 7. Our internal representation is never accurate. That's where the stories come from. Does that make sense? Now, what I find interesting is, number one, we will all make our different stories. As I said before, not many people have exactly the same story. We all come up with our different stories, as we said, based on our filters, values, belief, experience. But what I find even more intriguing is, if you take one individual, so take yourself, have you noticed that we tend to come up with the same type of stories? We don't create a complete new, different story every time. There's a thread, isn't there? Have you noticed this? So think of recent situations when you've made up a story to explain someone's ambiguous behavior or to justify an ambiguous situation. Have you told this story to yourself before, or was it a complete new story? Well, I'm going to give you the answer. Of course, we create new stories, but what is interesting is we tend to come up with the same kind of stories over and over again. So one of my clients, she's in a relationship, and her boyfriend, since he was a kid, has been told by his family and his parents at school and everything that he wasn't good enough for some reason. So he was not very good at school, academically, or whatever the reason is. Now, every time, and she comes to see me for that specific reason, every time they have an argument, guess what comes up? He feels he's not good enough. No matter what she says, no matter what she does, it comes down to him going, I'm not good enough. So for example, if she suggests, after coming back home, yes, that's the same client whose husband didn't make dinner. If she suggests, shall we go out for dinner tonight? He might go, and he did in the past. Here we go. I'm not good enough. She doesn't want to eat what I prepare. I'm not a good cook enough. Now, would everyone come to the same conclusion? Very unlikely. But because he has this experience and this history, he will create that story. And it's very likely, actually she told me, that a lot of the time, when they have issues, it comes back down to this story. Now, this is because of another feature of the brain that's called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change according to how you use it. So a good example that I read in a book a few days ago is when you think of handwriting, there's something quite interesting about this. Is, for example, take the letter A. No matter who's written the letter A, good handwriting, bad handwriting, you always recognize it, don't you? Because actually what your brain does, and the brain does this with absolutely everything, whenever you face a new situation, so the first time you see the letter A, your brain will create a set of neural connections, so two neurons will connect together. Now the next time you see the letter A, the same connection will be fired, until the connection is solid enough that you actually remember the letter A, which means every time you see the letter A, your brain will fire this connection. Now what happens when you see handwriting? Your brain will fire a similar connection, not the same, a similar connection. If you see another handwriting, another similar connection. But your brain, in order to make sense of the world around us, otherwise we would be insane, your brain is looking for similarities in order to understand what's going on. So the brain will find similarities, will generalize your experience to actually make sense and put labels on your experience so you don't go insane. So what your brain does when it sees the letter A handwritten, it will fire the connection, but it will look for the similarities with the original connection. And then it will ditch the differences and focus on the similarities. Now the same happens with our experience. When we go through childhood experience, whatever, good or bad experience, we create neural connections. So in the case of my client's husband, he went through a lot of situations when he didn't feel good enough. That created a lot of neural connection in his mind, which means he's much more likely in his current life as an adult to look for this kind of situations, to create those kind of stories, because it's wired in his brain. He's experienced this enough, so the brain will look for similarities. And the brain will try to create meaning out of situations that have nothing to do with it, such as, do you want to go out for dinner? Because the brain is looking for similarities because of the neuroplasticity. Does that make sense? It's a bit scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I ask you referenced the letter A, but is that every letter, or why A in particular?
First letter of the alphabet? that's the example I've taken, but it's every letter, it's every situation, it's every experience, it's everything, basically. Which is, yes, it's a bit scary, but that's how, on the other side, that's how we make sense of the world. If our brain wasn't doing this, we couldn't recognize people, we couldn't recognize situations, we couldn't learn. So we need that feature, but we just need to be careful of what it does in our relationships, in our communication with others, and our interpretation of the world. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, So let's look at other things we project onto. A little bit easier and very, very common is in relationships, the expectations. So you mentioned expectations a lot. The expectations we project onto our partners. So a lot of people go into a relationship or friendship or working relationship expecting the other people to behave in a certain way or the actual relationship to be a certain way. Have you noticed this?
Yeah.
Have you done it? It's very common. It's the common trying to change your partner pattern. Now, again, when we do this, what do? We have a model, we have an image, or we have an idea of how the person should behave, or the person should be, or the relationship should be, and we try to change that person to fit this model. Again, this model comes from our experience, having seen our parents, our culture, but we try to take that person and change them so they fit our expectation. And in the process, what do we do to that person? We don't allow them to be themselves, we don't allow them to become the best version of themselves, and what does that create in relationships? Yes, you've all been there. So again, that's a way we project. That's not very useful as well. Another one we do, it's just a few, I promise, I'm not going to make the entire list. Another one we do is, especially women for some reason, we tend to expect our partners, friends, boss, name it, to anticipate our needs. Yeah?
Good luck.
I can tell that you recognize yourself in this, or you recognize your clients, let's say. Now, have you noticed how it works? How often have you heard people say yourself, but you should have known? But you didn't express it, did you? Or your clients didn't express it, did they? Now, what happens there? In TA perspective, so TA is transactional analysis, that a lot of you know already if you're a coach. What happens, the person who's expecting their partner to anticipate and guess their needs, in which ego state do you think they are? The child, of course. And they're not taking responsibility for expressing their needs and their wants. They actually behave like a child, their inner child, in broader term in psychology. They expect the other person to read their needs and fulfill them. Now that's not very healthy in adult relationship because you're not taking responsibility, you're not asking for what you want and what you need. And a lot of the time, coming back to TA, that the person who's in that state is also in the victim role because they're actually not stepping up as an adult and they're not expecting, they're not taking responsibility, for their wants and their needs. So they put themselves in the victim, opening the door for the rescuer or the persecutor. So again, that's a projection, and that comes from our unmet needs as children, which we all have, but it's also recognizing that this kind of patterns will create an issue in the relationship. Because a lot of the time, well, who had a successful outcome from this? Yeah, most of the time, it doesn't go down very well, does it? Because if your need is not met, and you're in the child, then you're going to respond with frustration, anger, and again, your partner is going to go, what did I do? Okay, so that's another way we project in our relationships.